all things in moderation, including moderation. Oscar Wilde.
We are out in the middle of nowhere. And I said, so what are you doing here? He's like, well, I came back to visit my family. And I said, oh yeah, well, how long are you staying for? He said, well, we don't get a lot of traffic through here, so every month there's usually a mail boat. The mail will come out once a month, maybe. And if they come out, you can ask them for a ride. And that's how I got here, and that's how I'll leave. And I said, well, what if the mail boat doesn't come or they can't take it? Well, then I wait another month. I immediately go to like a big city in the US where people are running around like crazy trying to get stuff done. If they don't make the metro, if the train is 2 minutes late, they're upset. And this guy is like, if I got to wait another month, I got to wait another month. And it goes to this idea of like standards and expectations. In the US, we think the world is like this. And when we go, we set our expectation for other places. And then you end up in these places, you're like, it's just a slower world. And maybe the quality of life is actually better because they're not so worried about all the crap that we deal with here, So in that moment, I kind of, instead of waiting for the rain to end, I just kind of kicked my feet up and was like, just take it in, relax, and enjoy the opportunity and the experience you're having because most people won't get to have this.
Warren Acuncius has seen a lot. His work for USAID as a disaster relief specialist took him all over the world. He saw the aftermath of cataclysmic tragedies and suffering on a scale that most can't even imagine. But he also saw what can be accomplished when humans, from different countries and backgrounds, come together to give each other aid and comfort. It turns out that both earthquakes and people can move mountains. My name is Christopher Wurst, and this is
SoftPower.
Powerful.
SoftPower.
Powerful
stories.
Powerful.
Powerful
stories.
I grew up in Eastern Washington, Spokane. I feel like Spokane was kind of quiet when I grew up. I grew up thinking I was going to be a baseball player. A lot of my time was spent playing catch with my dad in the yard, right? It's almost cliche to say, if you build it, they will come. We were out there playing catch a lot. And of course, we had a hometown hero, Ryan Sandberg, who was, or is, a Hall of Famer now. He played second base for the Cubs. But it was still like everything came back to Spokane, right? There still wasn't an outside world. It was more about what was happening at home than anywhere else. When I first left and went to school and started seeing that there were things out there, my mind kind of exploded. That was probably my first life-changing moment, was saying like, oh my gosh, there is more to the world than just Spokane, Washington. The deal was you need to go to an in-state school. And my brother was already at Western Washington University. So I went to Western a couple of years, and I very, very specifically remember one event that sort of changed everything. And it was sitting in the computer lab, and a friend of mine had gone on a study abroad called Semester at Sea. And I had heard about it through MTV because it was on MTV, and it just seemed like a silly, stupid thing that party kids went and did. But he sent this email, and I got mass emails from other people too, and I usually didn't read them. But this one I actually sat and read. Maybe I just didn't want to study at the moment or something. And it was quite a long email. It was about, these are all the things that I've done and all the things that I've seen. And I read every word. Like every word was life-changing. And I remember finishing it and like taking this big breath, like, whoa. And then I lifted up my hand and there was this perfect imprint of sweat on the table. So reading his words and what he had done made me feel like there's something else out there. And it's not just an unknown. It's just not a world event in the front page of the paper because of a war or a crisis. There are things to see and do and adventures to be had, right? So that was the first time I'd ever thought about maybe I want to leave Washington State. At that point, I then applied to do Semester at Sea myself. We saw 10 countries on our sort of circumnavigating the globe. It was a challenge to take on the financial burden of doing something like this because a trip around the world is not cheap. But I remember one of my friends who was going from Western also said to me, she had talked to a woman who had been on a few years later who was writing a check every month to pay off the loan. And she said every time she wrote the check, she smiled. And so this was going to be my first sort of foray into adulthood, where I'm going to take on debt to have an experience, and I want this to be well out of my comfort zone. And it was. Semester at Sea was a chance to go to a port. You had, 3 to 6 days in a country. Once you hit port, you were on your own. You were not with the school. You were independent travel. And, we started in Japan and we circumnavigated the globe. I got to meet Desmond Tutu, which was amazing. We actually ended up going to Cuba on an academic visa and hearing Fidel Castro. He spoke to us for 4 hours, saw the Great Wall of China. And so I had this taster's platter of world experiences, which I had never even contemplated. I had never even wanted them before. And I came back, as anybody would, from that sort of a changed person. All of a sudden, the drug is in your vein. What do I do next to get my hit? Where do I go next? One of the things that I did on that trip was go to South Africa. So we ported in Cape Town, and there was an NGO, non-governmental organization called the Amy Beale Foundation. Amy Beale had been a scholar in South Africa. She's from California, was from California, and she was there helping to rewrite their constitution, right? We're talking post-apartheid. A lot is happening with Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And so she's out there working, and one night she takes her friend home in the township, and she's a white woman in a very black community, and they see her and they're having a political rally, and they decide to chase her down. They essentially kill her. They stone her, they throw a rock at her, she tries to run away, they catch her, they kill her. In the response to that, this group of men went into prison and then came before the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And during that hearing, the parents of Amy Beale showed up. And they supported these people who had killed their daughter to say this was not their doing, this was the political structure, this was apartheid, this was the unequal treatment of human beings. And it made the news. And her parents felt that it was important to remember Amy's work, so they decided to start an NGO. That was the NGO that I visited when I was in South Africa. The year after semester at sea, I graduated, I went back and I worked for the Amy Beale Foundation in the townships in George, South Africa, and also in Cape Town and in the prison systems. And while I was there, I read a book called The Power of One. This whole thing kind of wrapped in my head as like, well, maybe I can have impact. Maybe not only can I receive the adventure, maybe not just be a part of like watching and viewing, but actually implementing or actually having an impact myself. Going there and actually working with people in the townships, talking to them about what was important to them, gave me the sense of kind of a global community. A lot of the problems you deal with are the same that we might deal with in the US. We might talk about different standards of living, but we're all still humans and we all still have things that we have to work through, and we can probably help each other. But at this point, I'm only 21 years old. I know I want to work in the international community. And of course, at the top of the food chain is USAID. So very early in my 20s, I know that I want to do development work or something international. USAID is the ideal place to go, but I know I need experience. So I ended up going back to grad school. And I think the middle of my second year, I'm sitting in the student lounge with another colleague of mine, Buck. And Buck says, what would be really cool? Doing disaster response. And this was probably the biggest head exploding moment I've ever had. I was like, wait, you could do that? Like as a job, you can do that? Really? That's a thing? And from that moment on, I was sold. I had gotten the fix I wanted. I had the target. I'm in my mid to late 20s now, and I know for the first time in my life where I want to go. We look at people who do this work as though they're trying to help other people. But if we're being honest, we do this in large part for ourselves as well. We want to feel alive, we want to feel connected, and we want to help people. So that was kind of the realization for me, was that it's good for me to go out and want to help people, doing development work, doing humanitarian work, but also what will I get out of this? What are the life experiences I want? And when I think about that, there's a handful of experiences, especially since I've started working, and not just traveling, but actually working with intention to meet and engage other people, that really stand out to me. When I came into disaster relief, I cut my teeth on the 2014 West Africa Ebola response. So I was working as a liaison to a hot zone medical tent. So I got to see the people that were coming in and hopefully walking out of this tent, these local Liberians who had contracted Ebola. It was funny landing there because I actually had read The Hot Zone by Richard Preston. it felt very much like what I read was actually real life, right? Some of these things that seem so outlandish and so far-fetched were actually happening around the world in some of these places, and you could actually get involved and help in those things. So it wasn't with an intent that I ended up in a hot zone or working on Ebola specifically, but certainly reading the book kind of brought it back together for me. I remember receiving texts from Liberians, death threats saying they were going to kill me because I was there to kill them and harm them, that not understanding what I was trying to do, which really made for an interesting dynamic. But flying around to different towns, remote places in Liberia on military helicopters, landing and speaking with village elders, joining in on some of their town hall discussions about what to do and how they were going to stay safe, how they were not going to contract Ebola, trying to educate each other about what the disease was like when some had no background or understanding and thought their traditional practices were fine and safe. And then, of course, with many of them, we found they were passing Ebola along. It almost felt like we were invading in some ways because they didn't necessarily want us around. That was my first disaster response. Of course, I think it was, despite the loss of life, it was a success in that we prevented further spread. But of course, we've seen that pop up in other places. So it's interesting to watch the way we've evolved to help people, especially in hot zones or in Ebola outbreaks, because we have one going on right now. In humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, especially if you don't practice it a lot, I think you go in with the hero's mentality. A lot of people will go in saying, I'm here to help you. I'm here to save the day. Listen to everything I have to say. And I think the seasoned practitioner goes in and says, what are you dealing with? They start asking questions. What is this like for you? What do you know? What do you need? There are stories of NGOs going and trying to build shelters with the wrong materials in places that they shouldn't have ever built, right? So they didn't ask the question. They didn't ask about local cultural practices. So when you went in and you sat with these people, and I've done this in multiple places, in Micronesia and some of the most remote places in the world, where the first thing you do is you say, first of all, I am so-and-so. My name is Warren. I'm here just to sort of talk to you about the experience that you had. And that opens the door for communication. When you don't just assume that you know more than they do, because you probably don't, and you ask them to tell you what they know, and they feel engaged and part of the process, they are far more willing to collaborate with you and also far more willing to accept your assistance. You've built trust with them, which is the entire principle of humanitarian assistance is let's build trust and work together so that we can help you through this horrible thing. It's an emotional experience. It's not just a physical experience to go through a crisis like that, right? And some of those emotions and crises last for decades. Even now you look at Japan after the triple disaster 3/11/11, and there's still people living physically in temporary quarters in Japan. But there's a lot of people who are still processing what happened there. And that was well over 10 years ago, almost 14, 15 years ago. So I think really you have to, in order to connect with people, you have to be able to ask the question first and hear what they have to say, build the trust, and then you have a far more successful collaborative effort to get them back on their feet and hopefully towards recovery and some semblance of normal. In 2015 Nepal earthquake, I had deployed. I had been given about 2 hours notice to pack my bag and go. And over the course of, I think, 5 or 6 weeks, I was working with the military as well, getting commodities and NGOs to remote locations. And there was one delivery to a very remote mountaintop village that had been sort of cut off from the rest of the world because they had one road to the mountaintop and the earthquake just washed it away. They were trapped, essentially. And we had received word that they needed food, that they needed some basic commodities. We were flying out in a marine helicopter to this very remote location, sort of tiered to terraced land, right? They were farmland, and we were flying in two Hueys, circling in the wind and the rain. And the Marine on the headset kind of says, there's really no place for me to land this helicopter. The place they said they would mark with 2 red towels, that's not nearly big enough for the skids on this helicopter, so we cannot land there. And he says, what do you want me to do? I'm like, I'm just the guy in the back. Like, do not ask me if we need to cancel the mission, go back home, go back home. And the Marine says, nah, just give me a second, right? And I can, over the headset, he's like, just give me a second. And so he circles, and again, I've got videos of us, and you can see the rain is going sideways, and this guy is a master of controlling his craft, and he finally finds this little terraced land, this farmland, and he lands the skid, and the helicopter and the skid in this spot. I have this photo of a helicopter sitting in a little plot of farmland on a narrow little terrace, and a line of people shoveling boxes of high-energy biscuits with the UN logo on them, and I think an NGO worker in the back of the helicopter. You have the U.S. military, the U.S. government. you have United Nations commodities, and you have non-governmental organization workers all working to help a village of people who are also helping themselves by running up to the helicopter and creating a line to shuffle commodities away from the helicopter so the helicopter can leave, the second one can come in, they can get more commodities, and at least we can sustain them for a little bit longer. That moment to me, like I remember standing back and taking that photo of it because I wanted to remember it. It takes a lot of people to do what we do, to help people, because you can't just say, yeah, I'll get it to you. But if you're, 9 days by bus and there's no road, how do you get there? You need specialists. You need people with unique capabilities to get there. And that moment to me was like the entire world, UN, donors, governments, NGOs coming together to help this village. And there were people who were on their knees crying, who were so grateful that we had shown up. And that was one of the most impactful moments in my life. I know I have provided you something you needed, and it's what I've been training for 20 years.
I had been in Kashmir, Pakistan after the 2005 earthquake, and some of the worst devastation was in these small, very remote mountaintop villages, and they were literally inaccessible except by helicopter. And so we were taking tents and food and medicine, and again, it was USAID, and it was the DOD, and it was the NGOs, and we were flying into these villages, and I remember looking out the window and seeing these white H's that people had marked out as helicopter landing zones. And I would be like, you have got to be kidding me. Like that is a cliff on the middle of nowhere, with a sheer drop.
Right.
But these guys, and nobody thinks about these guys, but just the heroic efforts of these people and they're working on little rest, and they're working nonstop. And the minute they drop this stuff off, they're back in the air to go get more, to drop it off in another place. It's just,
The really sad part of it is that the helicopter, one of the two helicopters that was on that mission, the one I was on, actually ended up crashing a couple weeks later, and everybody on board was lost. That was a change in how I thought about providing assistance. Like, again, the hero's mentality, run into the fire, just go help people. But if you are yourself in harm's way, you're only creating greater chaos, right? Because everybody else stops what they're doing, helping the people in need, and then they start helping you. And I watched a lot of different governments and even the host nation, Nepal and others say, well, we need to find that helicopter, right? So it was I still have a hard time processing because that was the helicopter I was on. I knew the pilot who was flying it. They were out there ultimately committing their lives to helping other people. And that is the sacrifice that I think people forget about with humanitarian assistance is we are in many ways and oftentimes putting our life in harm's way to try and help those people who are, again, going through the worst day of their life. It was the largest non-nuclear explosion in modern history, right? And it was COVID. It was almost this perfect storm of the environment to operate in isn't safe for this invisible thing that's happening. You've got a giant port explosion, which was just basically a bunch of chemicals in a port that, because of tariffs and shipping and industry couldn't get moved or wasn't getting moved. It was just the wrong place at the wrong time. And so I ended up deploying to that pretty quickly. And a lot of my time was spent walking the streets around the port and just going into apartment buildings and talking to people. And the coolest thing that I saw on that was not what we were doing, and it was not, let's say, my organization was able to do. It was seeing what the local organizations were doing. Right? We talk a lot about the localization of humanitarian response, empowering and enabling people to help themselves. Really, that's what it should be about. There were NGOs and organizations that helped tourists just see the cities that turned into disaster response organizations. And it wasn't in that they were out doing major assessments. They were going door to door, knocking on apartment buildings, and they were checking on people. People who, a big organization or even the big government would have just forgotten about, So they were going door to door and saying, are you somebody who needs help? Do you need food? Do you need water? And they were the ones that were actually sustaining a lot of people who didn't have the physical ability to leave their apartments, elderly, those that were disabled. The revelation that local efforts are arguably more important than those that come in from the outside was enough to make me look at how can I do this at a more local level? What organization can I work with to help the truly vulnerable? And it's weird too, because my thought went a little bit deeper than that. I started thinking about human populations that are vulnerable. Who's more vulnerable than a human? And in a lot of cases, when you go to these disaster sites, you see animals. You see dogs and cats out on the street. And so a lot of my effort afterwards was interviewing and talking to people who do animal disaster response, which I think is just so cool. I mean, you're like these poor street dogs and cats, they have nothing. There's nobody there helping them, right? They've managed to survive, but especially when you look at like the wildfires in Australia and the koalas that were dying, and like you actually had people going in there risking their lives to help the animals. I thought that was just one of the coolest things in the world. I think when I grow up someday, my time and effort will be spent probably less on humans and more on animals. But it was this weird revelation that I got into Lebanon. I'm there for a chemical explosion, and I'm thinking about the street dogs, you know? The other one that's kind of interesting was Ukraine. I responded immediately following the invasion. And this is more of a personal story, actually, just kind of small world, weird events. I deployed it was to Rzeszów, Poland. It was a southeast corner of Poland, right along the Ukrainian border. And that's kind of where the humanitarian community was setting up after the invasion. They weren't running straight into the line of fire or the front lines. They were kind of trying to figure out what's going to happen, where are we going to work. And so I'm sitting in Rzeszów, Poland for a couple of weeks, and I was in school at that time. It was an evening class in DC, but it was in the middle of the night in Rzeszów, and I was on my computer, you know, in the dark of the room, camera off, because I don't want people to see me. I just woke up. It's 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And I get this pop-up on my computer, and it's an email from Ancestry.com. And it says, "We have your grandmother's birth certificate." My grandmother's birth certificate. That's very weird. That's how they get you to sign up, right? Like, we have a little bit of information. We're going to blur most of it out, but we want you to want it. So maybe you'll give us your money to like get access to the account. Well, the information that they gave on my grandmother's birth certificate before blurring the rest out was her name, correct, her birth year, correct, and her location of birth, which was Rzeszów, Poland. I'd never heard of Rzeszów, Poland. So I was, my mom, who's born in Austria. So my mom, she came over in the 50s. And I'd always asked her, you know, where was grandma born? Oh, she was born in Krakow in Poland. And so I get this email, and I call my mom the next morning from Rzeszów. I'm like, was Nana born in Rzeszów? She's like, no, she's born in Krakow. I'm like, are you sure? Because I think I have her birth certificate here. She says, oh, maybe. Yeah, she might have been born there. I don't know. So nobody in my family, I ask a lot of questions about history and lineage because my name is so unique. I want to know where it's from. And so all of a sudden I'm facing this origin story. I have come full circle. I didn't talk about this earlier, and not to tangent, but I read The Alchemist almost on every trip I go on. And The Alchemist as a book always messaged to me that it's not about what you do on the adventure, it's about when you come home. Right? There's this full circle of things. And so I was having my alchemist moment in Rzeszów, Poland. I was in this place that I would have never traveled to, had never even heard of before. And suddenly I'm finding out that this is part of where my family heritage comes from. So I started digging a little bit because I've got some time at lunches. And I find that the marriage records location of Rzeszów is just like a block from my hotel. And I speak to a couple people, one woman who speaks English fairly well and says, oh, these, you know, yes, your grandma was born here. We have her name in records, but the physical records are the only real data we have. So come back tomorrow and I'll give you what we have on your grandma. So I come back the next day and she pulls out this piece of paper because she's gone through the old logs, and she finds my grandma's wedding certificate. So not only was my grandma born there, she lived her early years in Rzeszów. She married my grandfather there, and then eventually they moved to Austria, and then they moved to the US. So I had absolutely no idea about any of this, but Rzeszów became not just this work or this job to help folks who were going through crisis, refugees crossing the border. It became very personal to me because now I identify that I am actually part of this area. My grandma used to vacation in Ukraine. I have almost a personal connection now to the region that I'm working in, and all of a sudden it isn't just a disaster response. This is a bit of my origin story, and I shouldn't care more, but I do care more because now I feel like I can identify with these people more because they have the same origins as I did. So there was something about that experience, watching that and still watching it play out today. I was recently on the Ukraine response as a response manager for the DC side. There's always a field team and a DC side. And I met a lot of the Ukrainians that we work with. We hire foreign service nationals who are people from that country who support the U.S. mission there. And getting to know them, it took on a very personal element to me. Not only are we connecting on a personal level, but now I feel like there's almost like a bit of a kinship, where I am invested in you because I can see myself in you. I can see my grandma, I can see my family in you. And then it becomes very personal. Now it is, how is your son? How is your daughter? How is your wife? What is it like there for you every day? And as you personalize the work, every little detail becomes more. So, I'm talking to one of my coworkers and he says, it's almost like living in Star Wars. I live in a high-rise apartment building in Kyiv, and there are little red dots flying around everywhere. There's drones everywhere. And you don't know if they're coming to attack you or if they're defense, but it feels like you're living in a war zone. Even though the front line is hundreds of miles away, my day-to-day is chaos. I don't know which day I'm going to wake up and something is going to happen, or not wake up because something did happen. And it really kind of personalized the complex emergencies, the civil wars, the fighting that we see in a lot of places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, South Sudan, Ukraine. We're seeing more and more of these like destabilizing factors. And it worries me because honestly, and I hope it's not a political thing, it feels like we're contributing to that now. It feels like if we pull out of helping people, there will only be more people in need of help. And that will eventually bleed over into regions. And eventually, I feel like if we don't take care of it, that will bleed into a global issue. So I'm a bit worried. I know I'm taking big steps past just Ukraine, but I do think that it has implications on our own security and safety in this country. And I just hope we kind of get our act together and start helping the people that need it.
Note that as of July 1st, 2025, when the current administration ceased USAID's implementation of foreign assistance, much of the United States' foreign humanitarian work has been terminated. In one stark example, following the devastating earthquake in Burma on March 28, 2025, the U.S. response was minimal, with no U.S. disaster assistance response teams or DARTs mobilized, and only a small fraction of assistance that we previously provided. Notably, China, India, Russia, and others took a more active role, exercising greater soft power in the vacuum created by the United States. Well, that is the sound of us coming to the end of the episode, but I don't want to end before Warren has a chance to answer our dubious Aunt Deb.
I know it's good to help others in an emergency, but shouldn't others also help us? When is it ever our turn?
I have been struggling with this for a while now. I may or may not have people in my family who have different political perspectives from me. And I've come to the realization that political ideology is just ideology. You place your values in whatever system most closely matches you. And so I've been trying to figure out what this conversation would look like, whether it is at a Thanksgiving dinner table or just over the phone or on Zoom or Skype. And I think my approach to it, much like doing this work, I should have learned this a long time ago, is asking questions. I think having these conversations and stating your fact and putting your foot down and saying, this is how it is, doesn't get you anywhere. But I think when people are heard or felt heard, that they are more willing to also listen to you as well. And so I think my approach to this would be to ask questions, whether they're tongue-in-cheek or very serious. What is the alternative? What is our obligation to do something to help people? Do you feel a moral obligation? Are moral grounds the appropriate way to make decisions about what we do or don't do? Are there legal authorities? Do you disagree with the legal structure? And I feel like if we start asking questions, and hopefully I can do this myself when the time comes, but if we ask more questions, we might find out, one, that people have really good logic based in something, or maybe they don't. Maybe they're just passing messages that they get from different media sources. And if that's the case, if you've identified that weakness, I'll call it a weakness, in their argument, then maybe that's where you can start applying logic. I think I would always start with the moral obligation to try to connect on a human level. We do this because we have a responsibility to each other. And we can talk about the implications of that second, third order effects down the road, where if we don't do this, then this could happen. And then eventually that could get to you. Or we can just say, how would you want to be treated? Right? What is your responsibility in making sure that there is stability and opportunity here and everywhere else? And when you are the richest country in the history of the world, and you arguably have the most political persuasion in the history of the world, don't you want that to do something good? And there are arguments of like, well, we should help ourselves first before we help other people. And I don't see it as a linear thing. It is not a 1, 2, and then 3. It is we can do multiple things on multiple fronts at the same time. I have a son who, before I had a son, it was like, it's me, it's my wife. We're good. All we care about is right now. But I think when you start having kids and you start thinking about the next generation and how it impacts them, you have to have concern about the implications of your decisions today. And I think a lot of that goes to all the questions that I disagree with my family on. It's like, wouldn't you rather be a little bit more conservative, a little kinder, a little more morally motivated, and think about the next generation? And I don't know if that argument will win in the end, but I think that's the approach that I have to take in order just to have the conversation without throwing food at each other across the table.
Huge thanks to Warren for taking the time to tell us his stories. Warren Acuncius is the Director of Field Operations for Global Support and Development, a disaster response NGO known as GSD. He's also an associate professor teaching graduate-level humanitarian coursework at the University of Washington. During his long service with USAID, he served in the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, previously known as the U.S. Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. He was also the lead humanitarian assistance advisor in the Department of Defense's U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, where he was recognized with a Joint Civilian Service Commendation Award. He has taught joint humanitarian operations courses for military colleagues on U.S. government, best practices, and policies regarding disaster relief. His active disaster relief postings included Ukraine, Lebanon, Nepal, and Liberia. Prior to that, he worked for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, writing operations plans for disaster scenarios. He was also an Emerging Leaders in Biosecurity Fellow at Johns Hopkins. In his free time, Warren composes music, much of which you've heard on this episode. Some with his band District Lights. If you like District Lights, you can find it streaming on a service near you. Thanks for listening. Along with our soft, powerful storytellers, we believe so strongly in the importance of U.S. engagement with the rest of the world. If you enjoyed these stories and this mission, I would like to ask for your support. It's as simple as liking this program, following this program, and if you feel up to it, leave a positive review. We need those algorithms pointing people in the direction of these stories. Want to help more? Share this with a dubious aunt, a dubious uncle, a dubious associate, even a dubious pet, but do it kindly. Our show's logo was designed by the very talented Kate Furby. My friend Kathy Zilski plays the part of dubious Aunt Deb, though in real life she is nothing like dubious Aunt Deb. Thank you, Kathy. And again, you can find more information about Soft Powerful Stories at softpowerfulstories.org. I'm the host and creator of Soft Powerful Stories, Christopher Wurst. Until next time.